The presidency of Donald Trump definitely marked a turning point, but it's not the start of the declining chemistry in the relationship between the United States and China.
Welcome to the ELIAMEP podcast series. In this podcast, I have the pleasure to host Dr. Jens Bastian, Senior Policy Advisor at ELIAMEP and also researcher in the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, to talk about China and its relations with the West. Dr. Bastian, thank you for this discussion about an issue like China that has been on our minds for the last years in a different kind of way, I think. So I want to begin by asking you, how are the relations between US and China now? Last year, trade between the United States and China reached nearly $700 billion, a record high, a fact that undermines talk of a complete freeze in relations between the two countries. So the relations are really so bad as we see it, or not? And moreover, do both sides understand the downsides of fully pulling apart from one another when they have so much in the trade issue?
First of all, thank you for having me in this podcast. The question you ask is important because if you look at just the past 10 days in the relationship between China and the United States, you could be forgiven for being rather confused. Secretary of Foreign Affairs Anthony Blinken visited China. It was the first visit by a US Secretary of State after 5 years. And he had an in-person meeting with President Xi Jinping. When he returned from Beijing, a day later, President Biden called his Chinese counterpart a dictator. That deeply angered the Chinese. And in a way, you could argue that it invalidated the efforts of Foreign Secretary Blinken in China. Blinken later argued that the president, i.e. President Biden, always, and I quote here, always speaks candidly, that he speaks directly, clearly, and that he speaks for all of us. So in a way, Mr. Blinken did not refute the term dictator for Xi Jinping in China. The trade figure that you highlight is actually, in my view, indicative of a disconnect. And it's a growing disconnect between what politicians in Washington argue, namely under the term to decouple from China, and how, on the other hand, US companies are doing record business trade with Chinese companies. And once you scratch the surface in the trade relations, you nevertheless notice some important changes. There are certain sectors, for example, quantum computing, semiconductor manufacturing, generative artificial intelligence, or pharmaceuticals. In these sectors, you can see that trade volumes are actually declining between China and the US. But what is not declining are imports from China. The scrutiny of Chinese foreign direct investment into the United States, that, on the other hand, is becoming ever more rigorous by the US authorities.
How did we come to this point, Dr. Bastian? And did the relations get better and then even worse? I want us to go a little bit back in the US-Chinese relations from the time of Donald Trump. Did then things change drastically between Washington and Beijing?
The presidency of Donald Trump definitely marked a turning point, but it's not the start of the declining chemistry in the relationship between the United States and China. I mean, how did we get to this point, you ask? The list is long, and I can give you a number of examples over the course of the past years, and they're not only associated with President Trump. Take, for example, the spy balloon incident and shooting it down. Then the dictator label of Xi Jinping by President Biden. You still have in the United States an ongoing but unresolved debate about the origins of the coronavirus. You have strong disagreements between China and the United States regarding human rights violations of the ethnic Muslim Uyghur minority in Xinjiang province. You have a debate between both countries since over a decade regarding technology theft or outright industry espionage of China in the United States. What President Trump tried to address, but it was created already before, was the surging trade imbalance between the United States and China, in particular, the rising trade deficit that the United States has with China. And his solution for that was to try and rectify it through the imposition of very high tariffs on a number of products and services. And it backfired terribly. I could go on in this list, but you do get the point. It's complicated, it's controversial, and it doesn't look like over the course of the past 5 years, 10 years, whenever you want to look back, that it's going to get any better soon. Both countries also argue very differently in terms of how they want to decouple from each other. The term originates strongly in the United States, the US Congress, in particular among the Republican Party, but also within the Democrats. Decoupling is something where a highly polarized American Congress can actually agree on. But I would not underestimate the following, and that is that also China has a decoupling agenda, even a roadmap, I would call it. And its roadmap is actually called Made in China 2025. And what it also labels the double circulation agenda. These are, in my view, strategically formulated decoupling strategies that China is already implementing, while the United States is still debating how it should execute its own decoupling agenda.
Well, in this difficult situation, in these difficult relations, we also have China and Russia. China and Russia in the middle of the Ukrainian war. So do you think that Sino-Russian relations are likely to deepen in the coming years? And how is that going to affect the global order?
Important question, difficult to identify coherent answers. The first issue that I would address is go back for a moment this year in March, when Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Moscow. And prior to returning, he told Vladimir Putin, and it's a quote that resonates strongly. He argued, and I quote here to President Putin, "Right now, there are changes the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years. And we are the ones driving these changes together." The emphasis here is on we, namely China and Russia, and in the view of Xi Jinping, that they can drive these changes to their benefit together. I think this is a statement characteristic of the strategic vision in which Xi Jinping sees Putin as an ally, together with other countries in what China now regularly calls the global south. I think it also ties into a narrative that China has advanced over the course of many years, which is, quote unquote, the decline of the West. However, in the Sino-Russian relationship, I would not want to lose sight of the following fact. This relation is increasingly, if you look at it from the point of view of trade, for example, of investment, it is increasingly an asymmetric relationship. Russia has become the junior partner in this alliance, and it will remain so for the foreseeable future. And in particular, Putin's decision to invade Ukraine has actually forced Russia to become subordinate to China, You can see that in particular with regard to oil exports to China from Russia and the price discounts that Russia has to give China in order to make these exports sustainable.
Do you think also that China's strategy towards Taiwan is changing and will change in the future?
To the degree that we know what strategy China has towards Taiwan, I think that we can argue the authorities in Beijing are closely observing any lessons learned from Russia's ill-fated invasion of Ukraine. The events of, for example, the past weekend in Russia should be alarming for China's Communist Party, and the manner in which the authority of President Putin has been directly challenged by a warlord that he actually helped nurture in the course of the past years. I also think that China is learning to adapt its Taiwan strategy in view of how countries in the European Union and the US administration are reaching out to Taipei, for example, with high-level diplomatic visits, with increasing economic cooperation, and as we saw over the course of the past year, in the case of Lithuania, the opening of a representative office. In a word, we are seeing countries in Europe, in the United States, reaching out much stronger towards Taiwan. And I think this is a reflection of not only support, solidarity for Taiwan, but also trying to send a message to Beijing in terms of to carefully consider what it wants to do with and in Taiwan in the future.
Another big issue is China's relations with Europe, and in particular with the European Union. They do try, there are efforts from the European Union to limit each other's access to technologies, commodities, and data that deemed threatening to their national security. Do you believe, Dr. Bastian, that that is going to continue? I mean that the relations and the cooperation between European Union and China is going to be limited in the next years?
If it's going to be limited, remains to be seen, in particular in what areas. What is clear, it's increasingly relationship defined by rivalry, competition, and by what the president of the Commission calls de-risking. What Ursula von der Leyen has highlighted in her speech about China and a de-risking strategy of the European Union is really reflective of how countries within the European Union and the Commission itself have moved over the course of the past 5 years to redefine its strategy towards China. You have what Mrs. von der Leyen calls de-risking through diplomacy. But there is also an agenda of economic de-risking. And you can see that this agenda is actually filling up with regard to the toolbox that the European Commission wants to apply vis-à-vis China. You have, for example, a much greater focus on outbound investment. You are trying to look at export controls. The Commission has just issued a proposal a few days ago to get into a consultation process with European member states regarding such export controls to China. It's a controversial issue, it's complex, but the fact that the Commission is trying to do that suggests that they are expanding their toolbox and that they are defining precisely what is economic de-risking. You've had the new regulations since 2 years now in place regarding inbound investment screening. However, there we still see some deficits because out of the 27 member states of the EU, only 19 countries have adopted the full regulation. I think that this whole de-risking issue is going to become very important in terms of how the Commission defines it, how the member states also translated into a strategic concept of their own, but also where the limits are, because where are the risks of de-risking? For example, you have to bear in mind, how does it comply with existing WTO rules? I think you also have to bear in mind that de-risking, if you want to spell that out in detail, you need a specific architecture of regulatory, fiscal, and monetary de-risking across numerous policy areas. And to have all EU member states on board to support that, I think is going to be a very tall order. And there are going to be member states who say no to that kind of intervention.
Having in mind all that you tell us regarding China's relations with the European Union, with the United States, with the West in general, with Russia, the factor Taiwan, how do you perceive China's global role in the future?
I wish I knew. Definitely it will be a global role, and it will be one where China tries to also define the rules of the game and influence the institutions, the architecture of that global system. For one aspect, consider, for example, that the Belt and Road Initiative, in October of this year, it will celebrate its 10th anniversary. It is a global initiative that for now a decade has not only brought together over 160 countries that are willing to engage in infrastructure projects with China. It is an enormous investment initiative. It is also a highly controversial initiative in terms of, for example, the debt implications, or in terms of, are many of these projects in infrastructure not only necessary, but viable in the future? There are countries who now have to restructure their loans with the Belt and Road Initiative. There are countries who have airports that are not being used. And there are many countries who say that their exposure to the Belt and Road is not viable over time. But China is also changing in that global perspective. It has, for example, implemented, or it has started to implement, 3 other new global initiatives under the term Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and also the Global Civilization Initiative. And you can see with all 3 of these initiatives what kind of a global outreach and what kind of substantial characteristic these initiatives have. China is trying to define and identify countries that are willing to cooperate in these initiatives with China, how the future institutional architecture on a global level in different areas, be it security, development, civilization, is going to look at. That means the Belt and Road Initiative continues to exist, but I think it will increasingly be overtaken by a debate about the characteristics and the execution of these other 3 global initiatives that China has put on the table, and where it is looking for countries that are willing to participate in them.
Dr. Bastian, thank you very much for this discussion, and we will talk again, because that is a story that does not end the relations between China and the West. Thank you so much for this discussion.
I thank you for the opportunity.
This was another ELIAMEP podcast with Odin Linardatou. Recording, editing, and sound editing by Petros Karpathiou. Follow us on the ELIAMEP channels on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and elsewhere.